Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here in Boulder again. Last time I was here was just before the last election, after which Trump got elected. And today I'm here on a day when Trump and the Prime Minister from my own country, Modi, are addressing a rally in Houston together. So I'm really pleased that I'm here with a group of people who are not rallying, but are thinking about ideas and singing songs of Kabir and peace. So thank you all for being here. I'm also very pleased that I'm in conversation with Sohaila, whose work I have known for a long time and admired her bravery, her courage, and her writing, of course. My own journey as an activist actually began as a journalist. I was walking through the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of women, rows of villages with missing girls. And this was about 25 years ago. And I began to ask the villagers where the girls were. The answer changed my life because I found that, to my horror, sex trafficking existed where little girls between the ages of 9 and 13 were being smuggled across the border of India and Nepal, put on buses and trains, and sold to pimps in the brothels of Calcutta and Bombay for as little as $100, $150, put inside the brothels for the next 4 or 5 years, and raped by 8 or 10 men every night. And behind the pimps and the brothel keepers were the moneylenders, the financiers, the landlords, organized criminal networks, and finally the sex buyers who were driving this. And the youngest girl I met at that time was a 7-year-old. So investigating this story was important because as a journalist, I had to tell the story. I made a documentary called The Selling of Innocence, and that was a life-changing experience for me because as a journalist, I'd covered war, famine, ethnic conflict, all kinds of things. But I had never seen this kind of intimate exploitation of one human being by another. So I wanted to do something about it. And I won an Emmy and quit journalism and decided to go back to the women in prostitution in the brothels of India to ask them what to do. And the first thing they told me was that get our kids into school. Whatever has happened to us has happened, but we want a different future for our children. So I said, fine, but I'll talk to the principal, I'll raise some money for the tuition, that should be enough. So they said, no, it has to be done systematically and continuously. Let's create an organization. That was a bit daunting to me because I didn't know how to do it. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a lawyer, I wasn't a social worker. I didn't know how to make a business plan. So I asked the women, I sat on a straw mat on the floor and I asked the women, I said, what are your dreams? And they said, we have 4 dreams. School for our children, a job in an office for ourselves, a room of our own, and justice. So those 4 dreams literally became our business plan. And fast forward to now, the organization is more than 20,000 strong. Its members are the women in prostitution and their children. And they march on the streets, they fight for their rights, they ask for changes in laws. And we have educated more than 1,000 such girls across the country. So it's in Bombay, it's in Calcutta, it's in Delhi, Bihar. And what I realized as I was doing this work was that the sex trafficking and the buying of sex was so normalized that I had to understand where the connections were to tackle on this system. And then I realized that it's so embedded in patriarchy, the normalization of men will be men, and prostitution is as old as the hills, the stigma, the discrimination, all of that the women faced, the oppression and the absence of choices, which people did not notice. So very often people would say, oh, these women want to be in prostitution. But actually I saw little girls who had no choice. Actually their choices were taken away by poverty, by caste, by age, by being female. And so, that's been my journey. And I began to see prostitution as commercial rape. and body invasion based on someone just giving money and therefore making it all right. And today, that's why this conversation is critically important to me with Sohaila, whose book is called "What Shall We Talk About When We Talk About Rape?" So I would like Sohaila to begin by explaining her life journey and how did she end up writing this vitally important book.
Thank you. Hello. I also want to thank JLF for bringing me here. Wherever JLF asks me, I will always go because I love you all. And the Boulder Public Library, it's so fantastic. I also just want to acknowledge that it's such a great, in this time where things are so polarized in both our countries, it's really important for people like us to have conversations because we're both feminists, we both believe in the power of women, and yet here we are. We have fundamental disagreements, Ruchira and I. I do not agree with her philosophy of her organization, and yet here we are together, and there are many things we do agree on. So I hope that that's a model for people being able to talk with people that they disagree with. So this is my book. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the book came about, what I expect it to do, and then I'm going to read a little bit, and then we'll chat. So I was a teenager. I was 17 years old, and I had just graduated high school. My parents had recently moved to America. And between high school and college, I went home for the summer with my father and grandmother. And that summer in Bombay, I went out for a walk one evening with a friend of mine, and we were abducted by 4 armed men who took us up the mountain and wounded us very badly. They all raped me, they hurt us, broke some bones, threatened to kill us, and they were armed, so we had to kind of do what they said. And at the end of a rather very long evening, they decided to let us go because I swore to them that I would never tell a soul what happened, which makes me feel very pleased to be here today because my book is now out in 9 countries. So after this happened, 3 weeks later, I came back to America and I went to college, still in bandages and all that. And it was fabulous because it felt like it was really far away from this weird thing that happened that had nothing to do with real life, which we now know has everything to do with real life. Then 3 years later, when I was a junior, I got a grant to go back to India to study rape in India as my senior thesis. And I kind of happily got on the plane and came home, went home. Which country am I in? I'm here. I went home expecting to find lots and lots of rape victims to talk to and maybe some rapists who would talk to me. I was just completely naive. So I showed up at home. Nobody would talk to me. My uncle tried to molest me. And everyone I met said either that there was no rape in India or it happened only in very particular paradigms, like upper class to lower class. No one had what we know now to be true, which is that most rape actually happens with people just like you. My rape is actually a very atypical rape. I call it sort of the Bollywood rape, the rape that is kind of comforting for us to think about because we think it's out there, it's monsters, but it's not. So I, at age 20, was rather indignant and outraged as one does get to be at 20. And I found a feminist magazine in India and wrote a little piece saying that I was raped, I'm not ashamed, this is what I think of it, I'm not the criminal they are, and I sent in my photograph with that. And they published it. So this was actually a really good thing for me to do because remember, there was no internet. So I could publish it, send it off, go to America and forget about it, feeling like I'd done my bit. And it did create a stir in India, but I was far away. And then I felt that I had kind of done my bit. Then I graduated college. I did write the thesis somehow or the other. And I graduated. I worked in the Rape Crisis Center for a while. And then I moved on from the subject. I had 30 amazing years of a great life. The rape, as we know, is an extremely, extremely traumatic thing. But one of the things I really want to say is that it's one of the traumas of life. It doesn't have to be everything. It was terrible, but here I am. I had 30 years of a great life. I became a writer. I married the sexiest man in the world, who is here. I had a child, And life went on. And then on December 12th, 2016, as you know, there was the gang rape and murder in India that somehow set off this huge conflagration of protest, which was amazing to see because no one, really, it was a topic that just was not discussed at all in India. And suddenly there were thousands of people marching in the street because of this young woman who'd been murdered. And I was sitting in New York feeling horrified at the rape, but thrilled at the kind of mass protest that I was seeing. And also felt like now my work here is done. You know, there are people carrying on this fight and everything is fine. And I was carrying on. And then on New Year's Day, I was on a train and I checked my phone for email. And I saw a friend of mine in Delhi had sent me a link to a Facebook page. I'm not on Facebook, so I had no idea that all this was happening. She said that you must have seen this. And the world media was focused on India because the world media loves to think of India as the pit where all the bad things happen. And many bad things do happen there, but they also happen here. So they were looking desperately, because rape was in the headlines, they were looking for someone to talk to, a victim. But in all these 38 years, 35 years it was, not another single woman had come out and said. So somebody found my Manushi article and posted it, and so suddenly they had a face, but nobody asked me, and I had no idea, and I'd essentially almost forgotten that I'd written this thing. So I got a real fright, and then all hell broke loose in my life, because media was calling me from everywhere, friends who had no idea that this had ever happened to me, because it just never came up, were suddenly reading about me. I went to get a sandwich in New York in the West Village, and the guy said, "I saw you on Facebook." It was really, really disturbing. And I want to explain that it wasn't disturbing because I was ashamed of the rape or anything. It was just disturbing because I hadn't chosen this attention. Also, my daughter was 11, had no idea this had happened to me. So it was all a bit of a shock. And then we talked as a family, and we thought that, I thought that I want to finish by saying something 35 years on. I don't want this thing in Manushi to be my last statement. I have something to say. So I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which went globally viral. But this time it was fine, because this time I'd chosen it. And I got about 1,000 emails in a few days from men, women all over the world telling me their stories. And it was very satisfying and validating. And that was it. And then I kind of watched what went on in India. I was a little horrified at what went on, because I felt that there was all this protest. It was great. It was in the conversation. But some of the results weren't so great. I don't like the way some of the laws have changed. I don't like the way people used it as an excuse to keep their daughters home at night. It was a way of controlling women. I felt like it was, again, being used as social control. But anyway, once again, I was done. But then I went on and did all these other things to kind of get away from the rape victim of the world stereotype. But every time I went to an editor and said, I have a book proposal, I would get back the answer, write a memoir. But for me to write a memoir with rape at its center would be really dishonest, because rape isn't actually the biggest thing in my life. So I didn't want to do that because it didn't feel true. So I didn't. I said no to everyone. And then actually it was only the summer of 2017, I sent what I consider to be a brilliant book proposal to an editor in India, who immediately wrote back and said, yeah, this is fine, but write a memoir. And by this time I just had it. So I wrote her a really nasty letter saying, I'm not going to write a memoir, I'm not interested. And instead of just slinking away, she wrote back to me and she said, you've been working on this issue on and off in various ways for your whole life. Don't write a memoir, but write about the subject. You've written about things like raising children. You've written about rape and war. You've written about rape in the family. Maybe you have something to say. And it just really got me excited. I felt like I had moved away from the me as victim thing, even in my own head, and that I had something to say. So then I've been unbelievably lucky. I have the most fantastic publishers all over the world. And somehow this book came out, and I want to tell you a little bit about how it came about, and then I'll read a couple pages. So I knew that I had certain points I wanted to make. I knew I wanted to talk about why rape should be just part of everyday conversation and what's wrong with the fact that it's not. We keep quiet about rape, and so victims, survivors, whatever you want to call them, feel really isolated, can't get the help they need, feel alone. But another really awful thing happens. We keep quiet, and rapists get away with rape because they know they can do it. And they know that we can walk around thinking, oh, rapists are these guys out there. We don't talk about the fact that it's ordinary men who rape, and it's ordinary people like us who have created a world where it's just normal. And to me, this, I'm actually quite a light-hearted, happy person. And it really outrages me about rape because it takes away that lightheartedness. It's suddenly, for no reason at all, your joy is taken away. Someone has hurt you. For what? They're not even stealing food to feed their children. It's only viciousness. And why do we as a society promote this? So I wanted to talk about all this. I wanted to talk to survivors. I wanted to talk about why we can talk about it as a really heavy subject, and that it's okay to be raped and be fine. The fact that I'm sitting here happy with my life and feeling pleased in general does not mean that what happened to me was not terrible. There was this terrible dichotomy is that if you're raped, especially in India, you're better off dead, zinda lash, living corpse. So either if you're not terminally depressed or dead, if you're actually okay, then it wasn't so bad. It was just sex. So then that made me think about the connection between rape and sex. And as feminists, we've been really afraid to talk about that, but we must. Because often what we call sex education turns into rape education. If you're teaching girls that you have to control boys, and boys that, there's a point of no return after which you're not responsible. That is not sex ed, that is rape ed. So I wanted to talk about all these things, but I also have a very short attention span, and I don't have that strong of a work ethic. So I did not want to go sit in libraries and read thousands of books and feel like I had to have this encyclopedic knowledge. So what I did was I just called every single person I knew and said, I'm writing a book on rape. What do you think I should do? And the most fascinating things happened. So I read, and I had my own thoughts and my own research. I had my 1,000 emails from rape survivors, and I could write to many of them and say, can I interview for my book? So I had this whole kind of database that I had kept without knowing why for 5 years. And then the book just kind of wrote itself in this wonderful, organic way. For instance, I told a friend of mine, Sarah McNally, who owns a bookstore in New York, and said, I'm writing a book on rape. She said, oh, my friend Yasmin El-Rifai is visiting from Egypt. You must talk to her. So I met Yasmin. She was my first interview. I met her in Washington Square Park in Manhattan. And she told me the most unbelievable story. She's about this high and really skinny, and really you feel like you could knock her over with a feather. And she's one of the bravest people I've ever met. She's Egyptian, and she formed a group called Open Tish, who were vigilantes, who would go into Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring when women were being raped by mobs of men and rescue those women. So then I knew I had to write a chapter on heroes, which hadn't occurred to me. Then there was, I called a friend of mine in Australia who said, you're writing a book on rape. I just met this dentist. And this dentist specializes in treating victims of trauma. And that was so fascinating to me. So I tracked down this dentist in Melbourne, Australia, and we Skyped, and there's an entire chapter in my book about dentistry. So how is this connected to rape? So I just went where it led me and talked to men, women, trans women all over the world. I spent time in a brothel and discovered a bunch of sex workers who were way more liberated than many housewives. I just found all these surprises, and I just felt really inspired by people's courage. And I just got a chance to rave and rant about how we raise our children, about politics. And it was really heavy and intense, but it was really fun because people are amazing. So I want to just read a small bit. And then I can. So this chapter is called Your Rape is Worse Than Mine. I should say Your Rape is Worse Than Mine. So I started with a quote from Kevin Powers, who's an Iraq war veteran, who wrote a novel called The Yellow Birds. And he said, "Nothing is more isolating than having a particular history. At least that's what I thought. Now I know. All pain is the same. Only the details are different." I am sitting in a Mumbai suburb with Kalki Keklin, who is an Indian film star. And she is telling me about the sexual abuse she lived through as a child. I am aghast at what I'm hearing. I thank her for telling me her story and say I cannot imagine how she has come so far in working through it. I cannot conceive how awful it must have been. I can't imagine going through your experience, she says. I can't think of anything worse. There's something slightly unhinged about the scene. Two grown women, each insisting that the other deserves the prize for worst rape. Is one rape worse than the other? This is a ridiculous question. Why do we insist on ranking sexual assault? Survivors do it to our own discredit. I remember sitting in a support group and thinking to myself that my rape wasn't as bad as those of these other poor losers. No matter how many stories, no matter how many victims, I am always appalled afresh. It always sounds so terrible. Mine always seems more manageable. I'm not sure why we do this. It's a weird phenomenon that I have seen over and over. In my experience, only individuals do it. Put us in a group, and we humans are usually eager to claim the mantle of victimhood. Collective victimhood is well documented. But when it comes to sitting in a room on an August afternoon and talking about rape with a fellow survivor, I'm always aghast and appalled and convinced that the other person suffered more than me. Perhaps there's some defense mechanism at work. If someone else is worse off, suddenly what you're dealing with isn't so bad. It doesn't always work, of course. After I had 2 miscarriages and one man helpfully told me about his wife's 6 failed pregnancies, I just wanted to put my head in a pressure cooker and boil it. But sometimes it does. I'm not wholly convinced about my defense mechanism theory. I know how bad my rape was, but everyone else's still seems worse. I don't think it's because I'm trying to downplay my story. It's because I know my story. I know it beyond the few sentences I've written or the words I've used to describe it to so many people over the years. I know the tiny little details, although by now it's pretty hazy, a rather wonderful side effect of time. I know what they did, and I know what I felt, and I know how bad it was. But I also know I made it through. When you experience something firsthand, you know its colors and smells and the full horror of the hands pulling off your shoes. But you also know the limits of your pain and suffering. You don't have to wonder. And reality, no matter how bad, is always more manageable than unknown horror. I was never in Kalki's position, so how do I know I would have survived? I know I survived what happened to me. No matter how bad it was, here I am. Here is the East River flowing outside my window. Here is a bowl of pomegranate seeds, deeply joyously red. Here is a little plastic pig that my spouse gave me when we first met. Here is my brother wearing a suit and tie, looking seriously at me in a photo that always cracks me up for some reason. Here I am. No matter what happened, here I am. Whatever the reason, ranking rapes is a prime example of the magical thinking that swirls around rape. Seems like no matter how rational we are, when it comes to life's big things, death, pain, birth, love, we quickly revert to charms and chants and magic potions. So what if it doesn't work? And if it happened to me, then it can't happen to my child. Now there's an extreme example of magical thinking. We all know that we ultimately can't protect our children, but we never stop pretending that we can. It's too difficult not to. Having a child really brings home the reality that there is indeed something much worse than whatever happened to you. Someone hurting the small, magnificent person who depends on you. While it serves no useful purpose to rank pain and suffering, we do. And of course, rapes do fall into some categories. Being held by warlords and gang raped for years just isn't in the same box as being raped by a stranger where you live and going straight to hospital. That's true. But you cannot predict which woman will be able to come to terms with it sooner. Will the marital rape survivor build a new life faster than the incest survivor? Will the young Kenyan flower farmer raped by the farm manager find peace sooner than the 65-year-old white woman whose assailant broke into her apartment and raped her? It's very delicate, this balancing act, to acknowledge that rape is just ghastly and to simultaneously assert that it is simply one of the many ghastly things. So I wanted to ask Ruchira, because you've worked a lot with rape and politics, especially in India, so maybe you could talk a bit about rape and impunity.
For the last few years, I've been running campaigns to have the implementation of laws which punish all kinds of sexual assault in India very strictly. So the bus rape, which happened on December 2012, was sort of a pivot in the Indian women's movement, where we were able to get thousands of people marching on the streets, which Sohaila spoke about. And women were able to speak up on television, in media, about what had happened to them. Suddenly the silence was broken. And it changed everything. And even the women who were part of my NGO, Apne Aap, who had been survivors of sex trafficking, many of them were still in prostitution, marched on the streets, saying that there should be a new law on trafficking, and it should be part of the bundle of laws being created as part of this on sexual assault. And they managed to get a sex trafficking law called Section 370 IPC, which defined trafficking as a crime for the first time in India, sex trafficking. So that happened, but also what we found out since then was that there was a backlash to the absolutely vocal women's movement at that moment. And every year we began to read about more and more educated women who were out in public spaces, working somewhere, who were raped. So that began first. So there was a journalist in Bombay, the city that Sohaila comes from, who was in a compound, Tulsi Mills compound, taking some photographs, and she was raped. And then we heard about another woman who was going for a job interview who was raped. Then we heard about another woman who was going to a pub, a nightclub in Calcutta, who was raped. And what happened was that very often we would find that there were political leaders who would come forward and say, but why was the woman going to the pub at night? Or why was this journalist in this, the Tulsi Mills compound, which is very dark, taking photographs at night? So the women were being blamed, including a woman who's right now in hospital, a victim of a hit-and-run accident, a mysterious hit-and-run accident. She's lost her arms and her leg. And she was a Dalit woman who was asked to appear for a job interview to an elected official of the BJP, a political party in India. And he invited her for a job interview, raped her, and then said, you can't testify because I'll harm your family. She said she would testify. Her father was arrested on some charges by the police to threaten her. The father died mysteriously in the police station. The father's witness, who was a cousin of hers, heard the witness. He also is dead. And now this woman is the victim of a hit-and-run accident, lying in hospital, waiting for some kind of justice. And in the interim, there have been many rapes that all of you have read about in newspapers here. An 8-year-old girl in Kashmir who was out grazing horses and goat, and she was picked up by a temple caretaker in Kashmir, and along with some constables, was raped for 4 days continuously, and then murdered. And the trial is still going on right now. You know, girls in a shelter home in Bihar raped, and the man who was in charge of the shelter home is again affiliated to a political party and is still not been arrested. So what has happened is that there are more rapes, and one of the reasons that this rape culture which is growing is the rape with impunity. Because though the laws have become stricter, those laws are not being implemented because the person raping belongs to some kind of elite circle. And this is the backlash that we are facing. So I've run campaigns against that in India. I've run international campaigns asking for a free and fair trial for Asifa, that 8-year-old girl who was raped and murdered. I've run a campaign to demand that this girl, the 17-year-old who's lying in a hospital right now, also her rapist be arrested and tried properly. And these campaigns have generated their own backlash. And so what Sohaila is talking about is the culture of impunity. And when we take on these campaigns, then NGOs like us or activists like us face another backlash. So my NGO, for example, has been threatened first with all kinds of things, income tax evasion. When I win that case, then we are told that you're violating foreign exchange. If we win that case, so there's even intimidation of NGOs like us, which are trying to take on this rape culture. And very hard to survive because we are not tackled head on, but through other means of intimidation. And I know that Sohaila has written about Asifa in this book. So I would like you to talk about what you've written about Asifa, that 8-year-old girl who's raped in this book. And what does it mean, this rape with impunity?
Well, you've defined rape with impunity really well. I think most rape, 99% of rape is rape with impunity because impunity means you get away with it. And the fact is, yes, we read more news stories of very sensational types of rapes by politicians and this and that and warlords in Congo. But the fact is, all of us in this room have dealt, every single person sitting in this room has dealt with rape and impunity, because if you have not been sexually abused yourself, either you know someone who has or you've done it. So it's people like us who are raped and who do rape. And most of the time, it's swept under the rug, partly because we don't recognize even what is rape. But about Asifa particularly, actually it was really interesting. I took 6 months to write my book, and the Asifa thing happened sort of in between around the midway point, and I had been writing about, I had been kind of in my head playing with this idea of, yes, you can sort of categorize rapes. Rape is rape, but there's kind of damage rape where, say, the Pakistani soldiers who went and raped Bangladeshi women, what goes on in the Congo, rape as a weapon of war, and then there's, sex rape, which is where it might be a date rape in the rapist's eyes, maybe he's having sex, or maybe it began as sex. So in my head, it was separate. And then this Asifa case is what made me realize that, no, yes, there are differences, but there's the same thing is at the root of, you can never separate rape and some weird kind of twisted thing about sex. Because in the Asifa story, one thing that's not mentioned too often, if you read the transcripts of the testimony that was given, so there was this 8-year-old girl. Part of the reason that she was raped, the ostensible reason that she was kidnapped and raped, was because she was from a Muslim tribe, and they had some land, and the dominant party wanted that land. And so the way to intimidate that tribe was to take and murder that child and take them away. So yes, that's all damage rape. But then, if you read the transcript, there's this really chilling bit where they raped her for 4 days, and then they hit her on the head with a rock to kill her. But at one stage, one of the policemen, I think, lifted up the rock to finish killing her, and another one said, "Don't do it yet, I want one more go." So what does that tell you? Is it sex? I mean, I'm not saying sex in the positive sense, but what is going on in your head that you actually want to do this? If you're saying, let me go one more time, it's not just about getting the land back. You've made your point. So I think what I've tried to get at in my book is that, yes, there is impunity. No one follows the laws because we all go march in the streets and scream and shout about rape culture, but then we go home and we serve our boys first and we tell our girls they can't do math, and it's all part of the same thing. So there is impunity legally and internationally, but we also have to look in ourselves and see how we are contributing to this.
And that takes me to just a little bit, and we'll open up the floor to questions after that, because we would love to interact with you. But the fact that even in the United States, 1 in 3 women talk about the fact that they have been victims of sexual assault. We do know that sexual assault on campuses is rampant. The idea of consent, boys are not brought up to learn what is consent, what is not consent. Girls are always seeking male approval, so very often they go into the whole paradigm of being groomed and then being recruited and then being assaulted without talking about it. And the sexual violence here is equally troubling. And sometimes I think that the Congo is not in the Congo, but the Congo is here, because the epidemic of sexual violence in both our countries, in India and the US, is huge, but also across the world. And what it does is that it foundationally changes the nature of a society. What it does is it not just fragments the person, but also fragments the way we deal with each other, cutting off empathy with ourselves, cutting off empathy with the other, normalizing the idea of violence. Because it's at home that we first realize that hierarchy is normal. We don't go out into the world and realize it. Because it's at home that we see that it's all right for one class of human beings to order, one to obey, one to get paid for their work, one not to get paid for the work, one to seek approval for what they do and the other one to give the approval. And gender digs a trench into our brain into which all other inequalities fall. And that's why we then begin to accept the hierarchies of race, hierarchies of caste and other hierarchies, and begin to also normalize the idea of a strong head of the family as a strong head of the state. So we end up often choosing bullies because we think that's the right way to do things. That's the way the world is. And here we are with bullies as leaders in our world today, across the world. So we have to think about what is it that is normalizing this violence and this hierarchy. And fascism itself eroticizes violence. So we have to think about what sexual violence can do. If we normalize violence, then can that become the breeding ground for fascism?
And, speaking of this business of culture and patriarchy, I spent it's been very interesting for me while writing this book to deal with thinking about men and women. Because, for one thing, I interviewed plenty of male victims of rape. Now that you see so much scandal in the Catholic Church about young boys being abused. And so it's very difficult to take a position where men are bad and women are good, because it really doesn't work like that. I think we're all part of the system and we all contribute to it. Men are the ones who have the capacity to rape. That doesn't mean they all can do it, but they can choose to do it and choose not to do it. So it was it kept me really honest in my book, because in my own life, some of my biggest heroes are men. My father was there when I was raped, not my mother, and he was fantastic beyond belief. Right now, I'm very pro all kinds of regulations on campus because sexual assault is such an epidemic in this country. It always has been. It just wasn't talked about. I don't think there's any more rape now in India, America, anywhere than there ever was. We talk about it more. But yet I have a daughter who just started college and I have a nephew who just started college. I want a world that is fair to both of them. So it's very easy to compartmentalize people, but I feel like rape is a crime for which we all pay the price. And so we all are really in it together.
And now we are open to questions, because we do want to give time to questions. And maybe 3 questions together, and then we can take 3 more if there's time.
No, I can only think of 1 at a time.
Oh, because what will happen is then the answers will become long, so 2 or 3 at least.
Okay, but ask me 1 at a time because my attention span is short. Yeah.
There's someone at the back there. Asha, is that Asha? Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about something that's been nagging me for some time, where I feel that, growing up in India, I saw a distinct sort of, a shift in the way women, as they grew older and had a son, and then the son was just like, this is her baby, this is her visceral connection to her baby. This boy, when he grows up, then is so nurtured and kind of so taken care of by the mother that ultimately when he starts getting interested in in girls, you often find some level of censure coming from the mom. And it could even graduate to other levels of censure in terms of it could be sort of saying something like, that's a slut that you're dating, to, when you get married, the girl somehow has to fit into this, this really, very pure culture at home where she's, for example, she's given a haircut immediately. She's made to look like a boy. Or the mother still has a lot of sexual control on the boy. Do you see any of this? I have seen this in my family over and over, in extended family, and it bothers me like crazy.
Well, I think that we have to be really careful because there are lots of stereotypes that exist, and many of them are true, but also India is such a varied culture. So yes, that happens. There's that whole mother-in-law culture, and that happens, but I think it's very easy to stop the blame at the mother-in-law, but it goes way further back. In a society where if you have been in an arranged marriage and had no power, and your first chance at power is for this other poor young thing that comes in, you're going to use it. So I think the system is more to blame. But besides that, I feel like, yes, that happens, but many, many other things happen too. For instance, in my family, my family is full of women like me who are sort of odd, and they're really powerful women, and many of them aren't married, and they are also very typically Indian and more liberated in a way than many Western women. So I agree that that's something that happens, but it's just one of the things that happens. And I think that often when you look at something like, there was this figure touted a lot when dowry deaths was a big issue in India, right? It still is, but it was a big issue in the media in the 80s. And there were all these stories, the mother-in-law sets the flame, lights the match that burns the daughter-in-law. So yes, I agree, women have agency, and if you set the match, you should pay the price. But there's a reason she sets the match. So we need to pull back and look at the whole system. But yeah, that weird kind of sexualizing of little boys gives me the creeps too.
There is a psychology there, of course, and, Sons and Lovers is a book I should quote now, D.H. Lawrence's. Sudhir Kakkar, an Indian psychologist, has also written fantastic articles on this relationship between the mother and the son, which is slightly sexual, and how does one overcome that? And what Sohaila is talking about also, that the power fluidity, because the women have to hold on to the men because only through them can they channelize power. So that insecurity also plays a role. And all of it is, of course, based on patriarchy, because why is the power only with one sex rather than shared between all? And what's the next question? Any other question?
I read years ago that rape is less about sex than it is about power. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. I'm happy to comment on that. That's really what I wrote my whole book about, and I'm sure you have your thoughts too. Yeah, I think that I went to college in the 80s. Yeah, in the 80s. And we had a lot of Take Back the Night marches, and we used to talk about this a lot, that rape is about power, not about sex. And I think it was really important that we made that statement, because we all grew up in a world where essentially most people didn't even believe that rape existed. So it was considered just sex. So we had to differentiate. But I feel that at least some of us have evolved since then. And so yes, it's very much about power. If you consider it as, rape as a weapon in war, as a way, this Asifa Begum, this rape where the girl was raped as a way to get her family off the land. It's all about power. But then why this act? It is a sexual act. It is, it is the same physical apparatus of sex, but it's used in a different way. So I really strongly feel that if you don't talk about the connection between rape and sex, you can't really understand it. So there is. I mean, in India, I think about marriage in India. We still have a lot of child marriage. And my parents lived in a tribal village in Maharashtra. And there was a tradition there that before the wedding night, the grandmother bride talked to the bride, and the grandmother groom talked to. And what did these grandmothers say? The girls were told, even if it's an older man, whoever, you just lie there and take it. And the boy was told, now, this is your chance, you can do it. So to me, that's not really sex. That's kind of a rape lecture, because it had nothing to do with consent. So yes, it's about power, but you can't leave sex out of the equation, because often people don't know the difference between sex with consent and sex without consent. So this is tricky, and luckily I don't belong to any organization, so I don't have to please anyone. But I do think they are connected. But I agree with you, it is ultimately about power. Do you want to?
No, I think Sohaila said that because rape is body invasion, right? So there is always target rape. Either in India, for example, right now it's Muslims or Dalits. In the United States, we have the histories of black women and how they were targeted for rape, or Native American women. So we know that there is target rape, and rape is based on body invasion. So, yeah. There are two people here and one there. And keep your answers short, Sohaila, because 3-4 people have to ask questions.
Good afternoon. That is a great segue. I was just curious about your thoughts on education in the role of rape, because I'm currently working with some organizations in Africa that are providing menstrual hygiene education and period care for young girls in Africa. And as you're probably aware, the movie Period, End of Sentence that won the documentary for the Academy Awards this year squarely focused on this idea of lack of education, and that if we educate girls, they are more likely to stay in school. Girls miss typically 4 to 6 days of school a month and typically end up dropping out of school and don't seem to have the education around sex and reproduction, menstrual hygiene, that type of thing, which I think becomes a precursor to this rape epidemic. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are around the education and rape.
You go first this time.
Yes, I think girls have to be taught to love their bodies and not to feel ashamed of their own bodies, and also they have to be groomed to desire independence rather than dependence, because very often they are told life's goal is to find a guy, get married, settle down. So first the father or the Prince Charming or whatever, and so. They're always dumbing down, they are shrinking their own space and their bodies, and this makes them more vulnerable to rape because of the lack of self-esteem. So we really have to inculcate values of independence in girls to resist rape, and for men to understand that sex with mutual participation is much more pleasurable than just going and invading someone's body. And and we have to move beyond the idea even of consensual sex to the idea of welcome sex. What would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, sex should be fun for all. I'm all for that. But about education, yes, I don't even know where you are, so I hope I'm looking at you. Absolutely, there should be education. You should have bathrooms in schools so you can use your tampons and pads, and you should be encouraged to go, because all this stuff keeps women down. But I really have a visceral response to all of us, and I know I'm guilty of it too, talking about all the things that girls should do, or that yet again, girls are responsible for their own, for the entire circumstance that they haven't created. I mean, when I think about education, I very much think about education for boys and for grown-ups, and how we actually raise our children and what values we raise them with. When my daughter was in 3rd grade, she would complain because the boy behind her in line would pull her hair. And when I explained to the teacher, she said, oh, he just likes her. What is that supposed to mean? So when he grows up and goes to college, if he just likes someone, then what is that going to translate to? So we need to educate everyone, not just girls.
Thank you so much for being here, and I deeply appreciate this conversation. I do work in this arena as well. I would love to continue connecting with both of you. How is that possible? Could you speak about, how to continue having a conversation? Website, like what?
We both have
Both of you,
websites.
yeah.
So mine is, now it's difficult to spell it out, but it's my first name and my last name @gmail.com. So you can send me that and I can send you the website. It's apneaap.org, A for Apple, P for Peter, N for Nancy, E for England. And then again, 2 A's, applepeter.org. So, but I can give it to you later from the festival organizers, or you can email me. And it means self-action in Hindi.
Thank
So
you.
that's why I deliberately chose a Hindi word for my organization. And Sohaila can, and you can follow on Facebook and Twitter if you can't find me any other way.
Thank you.
I have a website about my book, so there's a contact.
Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
Sohaila kind of touched on this, where men are also victims of sexual abuse. And I was wondering, are there organizations in India that provide support? There are. The other thing is, I've never really heard of any news reports of the kind of clergy abuse that is publicized here happening in India. I haven't lived there in many years, but I don't know if that is prevalent or spoken about. I'm sure it's happened in spades.
There's a big one going on right now. There's this Swami called Chinmayananda. And he was regularly getting massages from his disciples and raping them and all of that. And he's being tried right now. He was just booked a couple of days ago because this young college student spoke up about him. So there is a conversation about the clergy in India and how they abuse their disciples and children. There was in the past someone called, in Bangalore, there was a Sai Baba who was doing the same with children. And there was someone called Asimanand, Asaram. There have been different people, clerics, who have been abusing children, and they have been brought to book. Some have escaped, of course, because as I was mentioning, the larger culture of impunity is there, which protects the rapist, and a code of silence among men, both here and there. And as you know, I do want to mention that you all have been following the Epstein story, right? And you saw how long he was able to continue to rape women by offering them like jobs in Victoria's Secret, and there were people at the highest levels of society, business owners, politicians, people like Jeffrey Epstein himself was a high school teacher from Dalton who went on to become the sex trafficker. And why did he even die when he was under suicide watch in jail makes one wonder, Who else is connected to this chain or this ring of people who abusing 14-year-old girls who came from all kinds of backgrounds, from poor backgrounds, they came from special education facilities, they were kids in New York, all being offered something or the other. And now their stories are slowly coming out. So you can think about how prevalent it is, how pervasive it is, how prevalent it is. And if we don't challenge it, then we'll normalize this culture of violence.
In India, there was also the case last year of the priests raping the nuns in South India. The reaction was simply terrible because everyone wanted to put it under the rug because, we don't want to mess with the Roman Catholic Church. But I think eventually some of them were tried, but it took a long time. A long time. I mean, I do think that, one of the big things is it's true, it's huge, it's massive, it's terrible, but it's really a mistake to come away feeling like, we're done, it's too big, because the fact is it's really big, but it's really small. If you have somebody in your life who's been raped, it's really not that big a deal to support them. And as a person yourself living your life, it's not that big a deal to just try to watch yourself, to treat people with equal respect and to care whether they're enjoying themselves or not, whether the person you're having sex with is into it or not. It's not that big. I think by saying it's huge, which it is when we start to analyze it, we kind of give ourselves the excuse to say, oh my God, I can't even deal with this. But we shouldn't do that because, life is too good to let it go on in this ridiculous way. That's my final word.
I think we have time for one last question with quick answers. We just have a couple minutes left. Thank you.
I think there's someone there who's been...
Thank you. I so appreciate this conversation and want to ask, I also have a daughter who's just going to college now, and we've had a lot of conversations, and I've been working hard on helping her, like, with her creepometer. She's a really good detector of the creepy, and that's serving her well already, but she's already terrified. She's heard about a rape that just happened on her campus within the last week. And she's out buying pepper spray right now with her dad. And I'm just trying to think of, all the things I want to say to her. And I wonder what you have said to your daughter and your nephew who are starting college.
Well, I'll tell you the nephew, well, I'll tell you the daughter first. I told her to do whatever the hell she wants, whenever the hell she wants, because she could buy the pepper spray. She's very careful. She's very a nervous type. She's not hardly going to go take risks. But to me, you're 18 years old, the world is yours. Go do what you need to do, trust yourself, follow your instincts, because you could follow all kinds of rules and still be raped. So why should I start punishing her from now? I say, go for it, do your thing, know we are here, know what's right and what's wrong, trust yourself, and that's it. She is not responsible for not getting raped. But that of course, we've tried to teach her how to pick up signals, things like that. I also think it's really nice now. They don't let you move into your dorm room unless you take a course on sexual abuse and alcohol abuse, none of which we had to do. And as for my nephew, I asked him what he thought of all the articles in the New York Times about men feeling so nervous now because, Me Too, how can we flirt, how can we talk to, this is rubbish. And he said, well, I said, what do you think? Because he's this really handsome, charming, he was 17 at the time. He said, I think the guys who are nervous should be nervous. He said, I'm not nervous. I don't feel like I need to, I don't, so yeah, it's a thing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause to Sohaila Abdulali. Thank you so much.